Hi, I'm Len Rydell, the Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, but you already knew that if you've seen a number of these. If this is the first that you've seen, I'm Len Rydell, the Executive Director. Anyway, this is the third lecture in the Death of the Army of Tennessee symposium that we conducted in October of 1995. This introduction, 25 years after the event, could get me in a little trouble with my friend Sam Hood and others, but some context, of course, is necessary. At the time, I had only been doing blue and gray for about a year, and while I had a lot of research, much of what I learned about the programs I wanted to do and so forth was based on what I read. And the best books out there at the time on the West and in this campaign were written by Wiley Sword. And Wiley, who was at the time, he was a automotive parts expert up in Michigan who had studied under the fairly legendary Colonel S.L.A. Marshall, who was a biographer of, or a historian of World War II and the Korean War. Wiley had learned how to write history and follow up, something he was eminently qualified to do and endlessly fascinated in. His first work under Marshall's tutelage had been Shiloh Bloody April, which had been published by Morningside Books. And as Wiley realized that the business of writing books is to sell books, he became more colorful in what he was writing, and he wrote a book entitled, its original title was Embrace an Angry Wind, which was about primarily the Battle of Franklin. And he was explicit. His prose, even today, is extraordinary. In doing that, though, he was more interested in writing the story than he necessarily was in telling a full and historically accurate story. And his prose got to be very, very loose. For example, he referred to Hood, who had lost a leg at Chickamauga, as the lame lover, and who was trying to prove his manhood to his girlfriend, Sally Buck Preston, and so forth. And so there were a lot of extrapolations in the book that over the last 25 years have been taken head on. Nonetheless, for a book that just is a rock'em sock'em, well-written and interesting and entertaining book, I certainly recommend Embrace an Angry Wind to you. It has been republished, and it's entitled The Confederacy's Last Hurrah by the University of Kansas Press. Wiley was as fine a gentleman as you ever want to meet in your life, and I considered him a very close personal friend. When Sam and Wiley went back and forth, Wiley refused to engage in many instances because he was that kind of a guy, whereas he just wanted to write books and he didn't want a lot of controversy. And at this time, of course, the context of it is that Sam had never written his books, and the debate back and forth, which has subsequently changed my view of things, was different than it was back then. And I was honored and delighted to have Wiley in this. Indeed, one of the things he did, because he was so pleased with that, is he gave me a copy, an extra print of Don Troiani's print, Opdyke's Tigers, which was the counterattack around the Carter House. And so I think you're going to enjoy this as Wiley focuses on a brace of Kingsmen, death at the Battle of Franklin. It has always been more or less a policy of mine over the past year to just more or less ask for biography and ad hoc it a little bit and introduce people that way. In other instances, I've found that I have really omitted things that I think that the people who are here have a right to know. And Wiley Sword is one of those people that I think is probably better served by just providing you with his biography because it's impressive. Wiley Sword's a businessman.
He's an author, historian, and collector of antique historical American weapons. He and his wife Mary Ann have 2 grown sons and have lived in the Detroit area since 1968. Wiley is a graduate of the University of Michigan School of Business Administration and is the owner of Technicast Incorporated, a manufacturer's representative agency of automotive lines. He is also the president of Environmental Biotech of West Oakland, Livingston Counties, Inc., a bioremediation firm. Wiley is a golfer and is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Historical Society of Michigan. Having said that, I don't think there's anybody in the room that doesn't know that Wiley Sword is a prolific author. However, he is an award-winning author. His book, Embrace an Angry Win, is the winner of the Fletcher Pratt Award for the best Civil War book of the year. He has also written books such as Shiloh Bloody April. He has written President Washington's Indian War, Firepower from Abroad, Sharpshooter Hiram Berdan, and his famous sharpshooters and their Sharps rifles, Searching for the 7th Cavalry's Firearms, and Mountains Touched with Fire, which is his most recent publication. Even with all of that and the numerous articles that he has written for magazines, he is still toying with additional possibilities, including a fictional work and possibly 1 of 2 titles for the Civil War. So it's with a great deal of pleasure and honor that I welcome Wiley Sword as our next speaker.
Thank you, Len. I guess there's one thing I should add in terms of the family background, at least according to what my wife would say. I'm an only child, but she claims I have a brother, and that brother would be Wiley Coyote. That's what she's more or less mad with. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and I certainly want to thank you all for coming and giving up, I understand, a very good football game today. It's been said that the Battle of Franklin was the thunder drum of war, resulting in the most terrible combat experiences of those who fought through the entire Civil War, especially to the Confederate survivors. It reflected such an utter horror that many said that the personal terror that they had experienced at Franklin and the enormous futility of that contest could never be fully explained or told. These men had faced their ultimate ordeal, a literal hell on earth that defied explanation or description. Yet prior to the last few years, the Battle of Franklin has been little known to the general public, all but forgotten. It was relegated to the compost pile of history, a minor aspect of our most tragic war. Thus today, I would like to share with you what for many years has endured as one of the nation's historical secrets. Specifically, the Battle of Franklin exists as most intense dramas and greatest spectacles of the Civil War. For sheer drama, for vast pageantry, for the very essence of the Southern spirit, perhaps an ultimate demonstration of the valor of the American fighting man. The terrible encounter at Franklin on November 30th, 1864 is without parallel. To begin, I might put things in perspective by asking a question. How would those Western Civil War soldiers, if alive today, assess our society's perceptions of their experience? Would they have agreed that Gettysburg, Antietam, or other famous Eastern battles should receive the vast majority of attention? Would they have foreseen that every schoolboy would know of Pickett's charge, but perhaps never having heard of Hood's bloodier assault at Franklin? Indeed, who today speaks for the Civil War dead of the Western theater, those men who put their lives on the line and virtually determined the outcome of the Civil War. This question became the essence of why I wrote Embrace an Angry Wind. It was an effort to comprehensively depict one of the most remarkable stories of the Civil War, as the soldiers who were there would have expected of us to understand and appreciate. Specifically, there is an important message to be found in understanding the terrible encounter at Franklin. It's worthy of being known by every American. The inner fiber, the metal, so to speak, to endure and overcome, is among the greatest lessons of the American experience. Achievement or victory does not come without a commitment, both physical and mental. There is no greater message anywhere in the pages of our history. And as witnessed by the Battle of Franklin, there is no better example of the worthy fiber of our forefathers. To begin with, my interest in depicting Franklin occurred by pure chance. It originated from reading a remark made by a Union officer overwhelmed by the grisly carnage and the aftermath of Franklin. His perception involved a profound yet a very simple thought. As such, it might have been written by millions of men in countless wars throughout the course of man's history. Quote, I feel like one who witnesses a bitter wrong, a monstrous injustice, said Captain James Sexton in 1864. Call it glorious, to die a horrible death, surrounded by an awful butchery, a scanty burial by enemy hands, and then total oblivion, name blotted out and forever forgotten. Where is the glory? That question will forever haunt the families of thousands of America's slain, but particularly so the needlessly sacrificed victims of the Battle of Franklin. The 1864 invasion of Tennessee, which resulted in so much anguish, was a bold attempt by the South to change the course of the war. It was intended to deplete the will of the northern populace in supporting an exceedingly costly and burdensome war. Moreover, a successful invasion of mid-America might raise the prospect of a negotiated settlement. Essentially, the Confederate planners were correct in their estimate of northern vulnerability, with the fate of cities such as Nashville and Cincinnati hanging in the balance. Even President Abraham Lincoln became personally involved. Also, the threat of a military disaster at Nashville caused Ulysses Grant to begin traveling west to take personal command. Thus, from its inception, the 1864 invasion of mid-Tennessee involved high military drama. Within the soul of the war-maimed and discredited Southern General John Bell Hood burned a fiery purpose during the winter of 1864. Driven and tormented by past failures, Hood felt compelled to gamble all to regain fame, success, and the love of a woman for whom he desperately lusted. The loss of Atlanta in early September 1864 to William Tecumseh Sherman's relentless armies, Hood was blamed for his blundering generalship. In hopes of saving his career, Hood decided to take a greater risk. Rather than to withdraw farther south, he planned a bold offensive with the direct approval of President Jefferson Davis. He would invade mid-America, Tennessee, Kentucky, and perhaps beyond. Thus, when Sherman's columns marched south, ravaging Georgia during the March to the Sea, Hood's army turned north in search of a redeeming victory. As such, the Tennessee campaign of 1864 involved a serious gamble for both sides. William Tecumseh Sherman, by abandoning conquered territory in his rear, was gambling that a few veteran troops left behind under a good general might defeat the depleted but still powerful Confederate Army of Tennessee. To stop Hood and his men, Sherman had left behind only 2 experienced combat units, the 4th and 23rd Corps, a total of about 22,000 men. Other elements of this makeshift army had to be improvised from various scattered rear echelon troops, including town garrisons, railroad guards, and new recruits. Belatedly, several detached infantry divisions of the 16th Corps were summoned to Nashville from western Missouri. Yet their arrival and the formation of a respectable army seemed very much in doubt in mid-November 1864. In charge of this crucial project for the federal government was the outcast Virginian General George H. Thomas. Thomas had risen above suspicion about his Southern background to become one of the most competent generals of the Union Army. His men boasted that he had never lost a battle, and he had virtually saved the defeated army at Chickamauga. That Thomas was known as a cautious, methodical general, deliberate movement has posed a serious question. Would the highly capable, if rather slow Thomas be able to hold off the invading Confederates until secondary troops and reinforcements reached Nashville and were organized into an army? In order to buy time, Thomas sent his veteran troops to southern Tennessee under the moderately experienced John M. Schofield, one of Hood's ex-classmates at West Point. Schofield was instructed to delay Hood's advance, yet not engage in a pitched battle unless unavoidable. This was a key to what later occurred during the campaign. Schofield was not expected to fight unless compelled to do so. With the advance of the Confederate Army northward from the vicinity of Lawrence, Alabama, on the raw and blustery morning of November 21st, Schofield withdrew his 22,000 troops to the mid-Tennessee village of Columbia on the banks of the Duck River. By the time Hood, with about 30,000 men, advanced to this site about a week later, Schofield had withdrawn across the rain-swollen Duck River and was prepared to dispute Hood's crossing. Schofield expected that Thomas would soon advance to reinforce Columbia with units from the 16th Corps, then en route to Nashville. Accordingly, Schofield determined to retreat only when actually compelled to do so. General John Bell Hood, on the other hand, was intent on striking rapidly for Nashville. Known as Sam to his close friends and especially the ladies in Richmond, Hood was a curious mixture, a man of physical gallantry and an aggressive fighter. Yet he was also an awkward and transparent personality whose lack of refinement and rather dull intellect was all too apparent. Hood's credo, indeed his trademark, was an aggressive, head-on style of behavior, from fighting to courting women. In March 1863, he had met Sally Buck Preston, an attractive and beguiling 20-year-old Richmond belle who seemed to have every bachelor in love with her. Bilingual, educated in Paris, and from an aristocratic family, Sally Preston was one of Richmond society's most prominent young ladies. Sam Hood fell spellbound from the start. His up and down courtship of Buck was marked by many twists and turns. She seemed to care for him, but was coy and flirtatious. Hood threw himself at her with characteristic abandon. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the match was the darker side of Buck Preston, which had the whole town of Richmond abuzz. During the war, Sally Preston had been engaged to various officers, all of whom had been killed. This deadly spell caused one young Richmond officer to say he had rather face a whole Yankee battery than be romantically involved with Buck Preston. Having met and fell in love with Buck, John Bell Hood soon thereafter had been wounded severely in the arm at Gettysburg. Then at Chickamauga, as we discussed, he was shot in the right leg, necessitating an amputation which left him horribly disfigured. Now a National War hero and an honored celebrity whose close friendship with Jefferson Davis was very apparent, Hood had returned to Richmond to rekindle his romance with Buck. By the time he was appointed to command a corps in Joe Johnston's Army of Tennessee in the spring of 1864, the crippled Hood was formally engaged to marry Sally Preston. During the serious fighting of the Atlanta campaign, Sam Hood's frequent letters to Buck promised marriage as soon as possible. In mid-July, however, Hood was ordered to replace Joe Johnson as commander of the Army. Committed to aggressively defend Atlanta, Hood's subsequent headlong frontal assaults against prepared breastworks became both a costly military failure and a personal disaster. Hood's loss of Atlanta in late August severely damaged his reputation and brought about angry demands for his removal. Moreover, the slaughter of thousands of men in senseless frontal assaults caused many to doubt his abilities as a general. Hood saw the need to redeem himself with a major victory and was aware of the risk of losing Buck, who seemed all too fickle when faced by less than successful personalities and prominent circumstances. Hood's answer was the bold invasion of Tennessee, an attempt to regain the fame and success he so ardently coveted. Thus, on November 21st, when his men began trudging northward in terrible weather, with only 7 days' rations, Hood clearly was gambling everything. By November 28th, with Hood confronting Schofield at Columbia, Tennessee, he now was only about 40 miles south of Nashville. Since the Yankees were positioned on the north bank of the Duck River, Hood saw that the obvious solution was to outflank Schofield's position. By fording the river east of town and racing north to Spring Hill, Tennessee, 12 miles in Schofield's rear, Hood might cut off the federal troops. Despite Schofield's anticipation of this very scheme, Hood's plan worked to perfection on November 29th. With forest cavalry clearing the way, the Confederate Army was able to march over backwoods roads to reach Spring Hill, ahead of all but a small detachment of Union infantry sent there to guard a wagon train. However, following the late afternoon arrival of Hood's columns, only about 2 hours of daylight remained in which to overwhelm Spring Hill's defenders or cut off Schofield's retreat from Columbia. Following an initial attack that pushed the outnumbered Union soldiers back to the outskirts of town, the Confederates suddenly and inexplicably halted. Moreover, they failed again to advance that day, although most of Schofield's main force was strung out in a long column of retreat along a road by which they must pass under the very muzzles of the Confederate guns. Hood and his generals did nothing. They remained idle even after dark as Schofield and his bone-weary troops marched into and passed Spring Hill. During the night, the federal commanders hurriedly pushed their men onward, pressing hard to reach the safety of the north bank of the Harpeth River, another 12 miles distant at Franklin, Tennessee. The result was an enormous lost opportunity for the Southern Army. General Hood had been in the saddle since 3 o'clock in the morning and was greatly fatigued. His leg stump was hurting him, and he may have taken laudanum to ease the pain. After leaving control of tactical operations to General Frank Cheatham, Hood went to bed early that evening. When awakened and told some Federals were seen on the march, he said it was all right. They had the Yankee Army trapped, and they would finish up the enemy's divided forces in the morning. Hood never dreamed that Schofield would attempt to march past the deployed Confederate force that night. When Hood arose on the morning of the 30th and discovered that the entire Federal Army had marched past before daylight, he was described as being as ratty as a rattlesnake. Angrily, Hood chastised his generals, especially Frank Cheatham and his subordinates John C. Brown and Pat Flagrant. All were blamed for a lack of aggressiveness in attacking the enemy. The extent of Hood's despair on the morning of November 30th was indicated by his instructions to Stephen D. Lee, who had been left behind with his corps at Columbia on the 29th to decoy Schofield into thinking that Hood was still there. When Lee arrived from Columbia early on the morning of the 30th, he was instructed only to rest his troops at Spring Hill. Hood did not expect Schofield's fleeing troops to halt short of Nashville, and Lee was told to follow behind the Confederate Army at his own leisure. Much to the Confederate commander's surprise, he learned later that day that he had overestimated Schofield's ability to escape. Once on the road to Franklin, Hood saw the vast quantity of abandoned debris thrown away by the retreating enemy in their hasty march. The Yankees seemed demoralized and only desperately attempting to get away. Soon Forrest Cavalry, now in advance, sent word that the entire Federal Army was observed within the village, preparing to cross the Harpeth River on 2 rickety makeshift bridges. Hood's heart must have skipped a beat. It appeared that Schofield's army had been brought to bay after all. Immediately, Hood decided to act. From Winstead Hill, 2 miles south of Franklin, he ordered a massed frontal attack before Schofield's army could escape. Yet his tactical dispositions were a tip-off of the smoldering resentment and frustration still lingering from the Spring Hill fiasco. By express design, Frank Cheatham's men were going to be his shock troops that day. Hood intended to purge their ranks of what he felt was a reluctance to fight unless behind breastworks. Cheatham's corps was assigned to make the assault against the center of the enemy line, where the extensive earthworks were seen to be the strongest. If not outright punishment for their behavior at Spring Hill, the assault at Franklin would be a severe lesson to Frank Cheatham and his men. Thus, perhaps the finest infantry general in the Army of Tennessee, Pat Claiborne, was ordered to lead a frontal attack somewhat in the manner of a company commander. Hood and Claiborne exchanged angry words before the attack, and Hood made his displeasure known about the previous day's events. Claiborne was told that there was a concern about his troops' willingness to manfully fight on an open battlefield. Fairly blamed for his superiors' mistakes, concealing his anger behind a stern expression, the aroused Claiborne rode away determined to show his mettle. To his officers who questioned the wisdom of a frontal attack across 2 miles of open ground, Claiborne replied, "If we were to die, let us die like men." In retrospect, the order for the frontal attack at Franklin can be described as part miscalculation by John Bell Hood and part frustration. Despite the protestations of several of his generals, including Nathan Bedford Forrest, who pointed out that they could easily outflank the Yankees from their position and cut off their retreat to Nashville by using nearby Hollow Tree Gap, Hood insisted on a frontal attack. Thus, about 4 p.m., on November 30th, 1864, a day that will forever be remarkable, the Confederate Army, about 23,000 strong, marched as if on parade toward the frowning muzzles and fortified earthworks surrounding Franklin. Imagine the scene. Long ranks of men in butternut and gray stretching for nearly 2 miles across the open plain. Bands were playing Dixie and the Bonnie Blue Flag. There was a steady tramp of marching feet that made a sound like the hollow rumble of distant thunder. The weather was mild, Indian summer-like, and the Confederate line appeared, noted an observer, like a living wall of men and glistening steel. Waving above the closely aligned ranks were a multitude of red St. Andrew's Cross battle flags. It was nearly sundown, and the soft autumn rays of the setting sun sparkled from the polished gun barrels of 23,000 Confederate infantry. This was certainly one of the grandest martial spectacles of the entire war, surpassing in magnitude even Pickett's famous charge at Gettysburg. Yet the assault at Franklin was to become one of the war's most anguished and terrible events. Facing emplaced batteries, the poised muzzles of 20,000 Federal rifles, and well-prepared entrenchments, it was, as the men now saw, the very sacrilege of purposeful combat. Across that 2-mile valley of entirely open ground moved Cheatham's and Stewart's men, terribly torn at every step by blasts of artillery and volleys of musketry. Valiantly, the ranks of Pat Claiborne's and John C. Brown's divisions surged toward the blazing Federal breastworks. Here they met heartbreaking losses and hopeless odds. Placed in front of much of the Yankee breastworks, they found nearly impenetrable thorny shrubs of Osage orange. Beyond this was a ditch nearly 3 feet deep, directly in front of an earthwork made of piled rails covered with dirt. Thick headlogs on top of this parapet provided cover for defending riflemen to shoot without exposing their heads. Near the prominent framework of an old cotton gin were embrasures for artillery, with flaming muzzles of Yankee cannon that exploded hellfire in their faces. It was a vast slaughter ground, tangled by the thickets of Osage orange, ripped by shotgun-like blasts of canister, and exposed to withering volleys of rifle fire. The front line of attackers was smothered by this firestorm before even reaching the outer ditch. It seemed to one soldier that just by reaching out his hand, he would be struck by dozens of whizzing bullets. To another terrified Confederate who had joked with his comrades about who would win the race to be the first within the Yankee line, it was now a race in reverse to see who could escape the fastest. Many men lay writhing on the ground, screaming in agony, yet their cries were lost amid the deafening noise of gunfire. The billowing smoke, gun smoke, shrouded everything in an eerie haze. Through this madness moved still another Confederate infantry unit. Various trailing brigades valiantly attempted to pass through the hellfire of death in their front. They too met with agonizing losses. Among those to fall in front of the Carter cotton gin was Pat Claiborne, shot through the heart while in the forefront of the attack. A man of great honor, ability, and character, he required no soldier to go where he would not. The South thus lost one of its finest generals, an officer condemned by his commander based upon a cruel and mistaken premise. This outrage was quickly recognized by the men of his command. We were led out in a slaughter pen to be shot down like animals, wrote a disgusted Confederate officer. It was an attempt to make good by reckless daring the blunder which incapacity had occasioned the preceding day he had. Many of Hood's men had been led to believe they were facing only the enemy's rear guard, that once they advanced, Schofield's troops would retreat. Instead, they had faced the multiple emplaced batteries and aimed rifles of nearly as many infantrymen as were in their own ranks, all glistening from within heavily prepared entrenchments. Facing that terrible whirlwind of death that Franklin was later described by many veterans as their most excruciating ordeal, the worst experience of their lives. Yet due to the accidental placement of two Federal brigades in advance of the main earthworks, out in the open cotton field where they had no protection, there was a sudden prospect of success. These troops were Brigadier General George D. Wagner's, who had been on rear guard duty all day during the retreat from Spring Hill. By mid-afternoon, Wagner had relieved himself of the day's frustrations by consuming the contents of his whiskey flask, and if not drunk, was nearly so. Wagner's anger with Colonel Emerson Updike, who commanded a 3rd Brigade in Wagner's division, had contributed to the day's frustration. Earlier, when retreating from Winstead Hill, Wagner had told Updike to position his brigade in the open cotton field with the other 2 brigades about a half mile in advance of the main works. Angrily, Updike had refused to do so. His men had been in the rear during the entire retreat from Spring Hill and hadn't even had time to prepare coffee or eat breakfast. With Wagner threatening to arrest him, Updike had continued on with his brigade, passing beyond the main line at the Carter House until he found an open space some 200 yards north of that house. Here in the early afternoon, he halted mounted his men, and they had begun to prepare their breakfast. Updike's action was insubordination, pure and simple. Yet it became the saving grace of the Federal Army. When Claiborne's and Brown's divisions easily overran Wagner's two isolated brigades posted in the open cotton field, these wildly retreating Federals prevented the main line from firing due to the fear of hitting their own men. With the Confederates close behind, a wild stampede of Union soldiers swept along the Columbia Pike, past and through the main earthwork fortifications at the Carter House. Panic seized the defenders at the main line, and they too began wildly running. Amid all this commotion, just behind the Carter House, in the immediate rear, stood Updike's isolated brigade. Due to the confusion of the moment, an Illinois major shouted, "Forward to the works!" Updike, who at first attempted to halt the movement, soon realized it was hopeless to try and stop the men. He too gave the order to advance. Thus, like two ocean waves crashing together, the charging ranks of Federals and Confederates met in the vicinity of the Carter House. It became one of the most vicious hand-to-hand conflicts of the war. For about 20 minutes, Claiborne's and Brown's men, many of whom were out of breath after chasing Wagner's men for half a mile, fought Updike soldiers with bayonets, club muskets, swords, revolvers, rocks, and even bare hands. Finally, Updike's brigade and several other units were able to halt the southern breakthrough, and the line stabilized with the Confederates holding tenaciously to the outer ditch of the main entrenchment. Updike's men remained posted along a secondary line at the edge of the Carter House garden. For hours, this vicious firefight continued, with neither side able to advance. However, due to an unusual angle in the main line of works, where the Carter cotton gin extended beyond the main line of the Columbia Pike, the Federals defending the gin house were able to fire into the flank and rear of the Confederates exposed in the ditches along the pike. This deadly enfilade fire killed so many Confederates that the ditches ran red with blood. Bodies were soon literally piled one on top of the other. The worst part came for the survivors when they saw that there was no escape. To attempt to retreat across that deadly open ground was certain death. Yet to remain in the ditches was to be shot into from the flank. Many times, Hood's men valiantly attempted to cross over the parapets and attack the Yankee troops. They were always hurled back. Thousands of dead and dying littered the ground between the two barricaded lines. Screams of agony and cries for help went unheeded. The 175th Ohio Infantry, a new unit, continued firing into the ditch despite shouts from the trapped gray soldiers to cease firing. They would surrender. The boys from the 175th were so nervous, noted a soldier, that they just kept firing. So much the better, he later mused, for all they kill, we won't have to fight or feed anymore. The ditch remained a seething cauldron of hell. There was no way to safely escape. The trapped soldier just lay there suffering. Many sustained repeated wounds, and their blood ran into pools. Some men even began chewing on their fingers due to the terror, their intense pain, and the need to keep from crying out like wild animals. One soldier remembered he was ravishingly thirsty, yet when he attempted to drink from the water found lying in the ditch, it tasted of blood, and he spit it out. This incredible ordeal continued for hours for these trapped men, until at last darkness came and some were able to crawl away from this hideous carnage. Amazing as it seems today, despite the awful butchery, Hood would not accept the inevitable. Desperately, he sent some of Stephen D. Lee's newly arrived troops to make a frontal night attack against the same strong line of trenches. They too were slaughtered like so many sheep during a fearful firefight that lit up the night as if it were daylight. In all, by evening, Hood's grand frontal assaults at Franklin had become a terrible, useless sacrifice. Yet Hood continued to brood over his failure to win a big victory. Incredibly, that night, he issued orders for another massed assault, which was to occur at 9 o'clock the following morning. Mercifully, however, Hood's second massed assault never began. After 5 hours of vicious, close-range fighting, Schofield's troops were found to were withdrawn, and it was learned the Yankees had marched to Nashville in the middle of the night. Schofield had decided not to risk further combat once his wagons had been safely moved across the Harpeth River. Yet the Federal retreat from Franklin belied the results. It had been one of the most stunning defeats ever endured by a Southern army. Essentially, the Confederate Army of Tennessee was a wreck. About 7,000 casualties had been sustained in 2 hours of daylight and 3 of darkness. 65 commanders of divisions, brigades, or regiments numbered among the casualties. 13 of 28 Southern general officers exposed in the fighting were killed, wounded, or missing. Among the irreplaceable slain, of course, is Pat Claiborne, the most brilliant general who had died leading what amounted to a suicidal attack. As you can well imagine, the psychological effect of Franklin on Southern morale was devastating. The fight at Franklin was later acknowledged by many of Hood's men as the most desperate and hardest fought battle of the entire war, exceeding for fierceness even the bloody battles around Atlanta. Furthermore, it had been a senseless battle, one that need not have been fought. Schofield might have been flanked out of his position at Franklin, as Claiborne, Forrest, and others had urged. Yet Hood had gambled everything on the aggressive head-on style of warfare that he was noted for. Instead of the redeeming victory he so desperately sought, he had only succeeded in ruining his army. On the day after the fight at Franklin, surviving soldiers of his army wandered the corpse-strewn battlefield and were appalled at what they saw. So many bodies literally piled one on top of the other in the outer ditches. The utter futility and brutal waste of life was fully apparent. The firestorm of bullets that had swept the open plain was discovered to have furrowed the ground, giving it the appearance of a plowed farmer's field. Why, oh why, had they been allowed to wander over that terrible field? Asked the soldier. Thereafter, the men became demoralized and their spirits were permanently broken. Repeated disasters under Hood had taken its full toll. The men understood they were not being led to victory, but only repeatedly into a horrible slaughter pen. Thereafter, the terrible specter of Franklin stalked among us, wrote a Mississippi private. the Army of Tennessee now seemed to be but a hollow shell, intact in form only. The vital fiber was gone, drained by the torrent of Southern blood spilled at obscure Franklin, Tennessee. A Mississippi sergeant of Sears Brigade perhaps summed up the awful tragedy when he wrote, "My heart is full of tears. Hood's Tennessee campaign is the most disastrous of any we have yet sustained. When I reflect on all of the woes and misery, on the thousands of slain and maimed heroes who have poured out their blood as water, I feel a wild spirit of resentment. The real sentiment of this Army is for peace on almost any terms." Today, in reflecting on such sentiments, we analyze the grim carnage of Franklin and consider the plight of gallant men such as Pat Claiborne and wonder why and for what purpose. Indeed, Claiborne's tragic fate perhaps best reflects that battle's agony. Wrongfully denied by his superiors in life and a brilliant talent squandered needlessly, Patrick Claiborne's life seemingly reflects the injustice so prevalent in war. Yet perhaps, in a larger sense, the brutal outrage of Franklin only exalts what Claiborne held most precious, man's moral courage. Claiborne's example reflected the larger worth of those valiant men who struggled at Franklin against hopeless odds. For Claiborne, to risk life, the brightest of futures, wealth, property, and his deep love for his fiancée Susan Tarleton was insignificant compared to compromising one's honor and duty. Even to this day, we continue to ponder what is the real meaning and justification for life. To Pat Claiborne and his men, the answer lay not in a materialistic, but in a moral sense. To set an example, live apart, and die for the same reason, it was integrity and character, far beyond the ordinary, their greatest gift and legacy. Perhaps it was not a lost cause that Pat Claiborne and his soldiers gave their lives for. The true cause may have been the ultimate dignity of mankind, to overcome in spite of the obstacles that confront us, or at least to try with all of one's heart and soul. Indeed, Confederate soldiers that charged the grim entrenchments at Franklin knew above all else that our destiny extends only as far as our inner values. That perhaps is the essence of their life's message. We can take great pride in such men and well remember their investment in us. Tomorrow, we shall conclude the terrible but compelling story of Hood's 1864 invasion of Tennessee with the inevitable sequel to Franklin. It was a tragedy befitting that which had so gruesomely begun on November 30th, 1864, one of American history's most horrid and frightening days. If Franklin had inflicted the mortal wound, Nashville would produce the imminent death. Yet there was another chapter to be written in the outstanding story of the Army of Tennessee, one that revealed even more about the vibrant character and spirit of the Southern fighting man. To that marvelous quality, amazing fortitude, we shall return once more tomorrow morning. Thank you very much. Sure.
When did Hood marry Independence?
That was in 1867 or 1868, I believe. That almost coincided with the marriage of Buck Preston to Raleigh Lowndes, who had been at one time the so-called sweetheart early in the war of Buck Preston. So there was somewhat of an irony there that Hood lost Buck Preston, and Buck went on to marry another Southern belle almost at the same time that he had lost, that Buck was married.
Were they North?
I believe so, yes, they were from the North. Yes, sir.
Mr. Sword, if you could just sidetrack just a little bit there, but maybe you have some information I don't. Yesterday we were at the Carson Plantation, saw John McGavin Cemetery, which was a thrill for me because I had never seen it before. John McGavin, as you know, had a brother by the name of Randall McGavin, who was mayor of Nashville. He had a nephew by the name of Randall William McGavin, who was also mayor of Nashville and the commanding officer of the 10th Tennessee Infantry Irish. And 35 years ago, Herschel Gower wrote his Pen and Sword, and it's obvious that Colonel Randall McGavin's favorite uncle was Colonel John McGavin, but I have not been able to find out any personal information at all about John McGavin. And I'm wondering, in your research, did you run across anything about John McGavin himself?
I'll have to look that up to be absolutely certain. It seems to me I did have some information on the McGavick family, but I cannot say with certainty that I have anything on Colonel John McGavick per se. But yes, the McGavick family obviously was very, very prominent in the Nashville area. Franklin.
Yeah, there's still a pike. I don't know where it is. Still a McGavick pike.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Okay, thank you very much.